Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for the AI for Social Good webinar. Just a couple of quick housekeeping bits before I introduce our wonderful guest today. So I've recently published a white paper on AI for Social Good, which you can find on our website under the videos tab. You'll also be emailed the download link after the webinar tomorrow, so you should be able to access it then. Also, at the end of the session today, we'll take 10 minutes or so to answer some of your questions. So if anything comes up throughout the discussion that you'd like to ask or comment on, just pop it in the questions box and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, great. So thank you for all joining us today. Let's get started. So I'm joined today by Anirudh Koul, who's head of the AI research at Aira, and also Michael Martin, head of communications at Signalfire. So, hi guys, thank you so much for joining me. So to kick off, it would be great if you could introduce yourselves and give everyone a little bit of background about your work. So, Michael, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Michael Martin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this morning or this evening, depending on where you are, I suppose. I am the head of communities at Signalfire. Signalfire is a early stage and growth stage venture capital firm. My role on the team is to work across our portfolio companies and with our internal investment team to build a community of top data scientists in the United States, as well as, frankly, across the world. We're currently focused in building these communities in San Francisco and in New York. And this really includes bringing together folks for small, medium, and large-scale events to discuss the implications and applications of AI. My background is, prior to this role, rather, I was actually the head of, or the manager of the AI X Prize at the X Prize Foundation. That prize is a four-year, $5 million competition focused on using AI and advancing AI for social good. Generally speaking, my background is I'm a city planner by trade. I come from a background of community organizing and public policy, so all of my work in this field is not necessarily technical, and yet it is really focused on those perspectives of how do we engage people in the process of the development of these technologies, and people who perhaps are not typically involved in these development processes, and really assure that they are being applied in ways that are beneficial for not only just businesses, but perhaps institutions and communities as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. So Anirudh, do you want to kind of introduce yourself and give us a quick overview as well?
Absolutely. So before I will start, there's something that connects Michael and me very closely. He just mentioned about X Prize AI Prize, and just last Friday, I submitted a wildcard entry into that particular contest, so I can thank him if something good happens later on. So hi everyone. Hi everyone. I am Anirudh Koul. I am the head of AI and research at a company called Aira. Aira stands for Artificial Intelligence Remote Assistance. So the fancy acronym is basically a tool for people who are blind and low vision, where they can use an app or a smart glass where they press a button and they instantly get connected with a remote human agent who can then describe what a camera on their phone app or the smart glass is seeing, and then guide them through their life's journey for whenever somebody needs help. For example, somebody ran the Boston Marathon, using this technology. People are, trying to do new amazing things every day. I had heard an example of someone painting, but as I said, this is artificial intelligence and remote assistance. So we are slowly starting to look at how humans and AI can work together, and AI can slowly learn from humans to assist people more independently. Prior to Aira, for 6 years, I've been working in the area of using AI for people with disabilities, for accessibility. I used to work at Microsoft AI and Research, where I built a number of projects. One of them, which I founded, called Seeing AI, is considered the de facto app in the blind community. So what's really exciting to see is when people see what AI for good can do, they get motivated to use their talents, and this community just keeps growing. It's exciting. You get to see the value applied in everyday life, and you get to when people see the benefits something can bring, I think everybody comes together as a community to take it forward.
Yeah, definitely. So, Anirudh, what do you think, before we kind of get a bit more stuck into everything, what does AI for social good mean to you?
I think if technology in general, if it can address societal problems to take humanity towards a more positive direction, uh, in any way. So it doesn't just need to be AI, but it could be almost anything that can help address a societal problem. Now, as time went on, you could see data analytics being used for social good, machine learning being used for social good, and now finally AI for social good. I think for this particular conversation, we think of more like deep learning related areas. But I would also mention that there's a lot of general machine learning and data analytics that also comes along with for many of the problems that we might discuss today, or that are used out already.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, did you have anything to add there on what AI for social good really means from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to actually kind of turn the question on its head a bit, and
Absolutely.
I think we really need to, I think, before and I may well play this part during the webinar today, so forgive me for being a bit of a sociologist on this side, if you will. That is closer to my background. So I think that we really need to start to question the assumptions of what we mean when we say AI for social good. And I think we need to question what social good actually is comprised of, and frankly, for whom, right? That's the primary question I think we need to ask. And I think that, like, when we are defining it, we need to find clearly who our user is, and if that group is in fact like an impacted community or a marginalized community, and then I think you can start to go from there, right? So I think that, like, for instance, what Anirudh is working on, there's a clear application that there is a community that is marginalized in some way, a community of folks with disabilities, and that by using this technology, he is solving a very core problem for them. Whereas I think that the terminology AI for social good can get very easily thrown about, because like one could ostensibly make the case that anything could be social good. And I think that this is a problem of like the infinite justifications. So I think that, like, when we ask this question, we really just need to be clear on terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And so, Michael, kind of carrying on from that, how do you think AI is currently being used for social good, and where do you think we're going to see it used in the future?
Yeah, I think that there's like a bunch of clear use cases. The places where, and I can get into more detail in a moment, but I think the places that we see it most being applied is those where there is already a lot of data being collected, and specifically labeled data. So I think that's why you see like the proliferation, for instance, in healthcare, and the proliferation of these things in, say, crops and farming. Right, you already have vested interests in those fields that are collecting massive amounts of data, and frankly have been labeling that data. And while those labels may not necessarily be entirely applicable or up to snuff for a researcher or an engineer, they're much more advanced than other fields, for instance. So I think that I really see it right now being being used for good in those particular places. So medicine, and like farming and or crop science and whatnot. Also financial, so fintech. I think there's a massive applications for it. People who have been left out of the banking industry generally. So those who maybe are unable or have been unable to get loans or credit, or even just bank accounts generally. There's a lot of movement towards that, and I think so. Those are like the three that come to mind immediately. But this is by no means to discount like the massive amount of applications that are already happening, but perhaps on a smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anirudh, what about you? What are your thoughts on that point?
So a really good place that I often see to start is with the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and start to look at how the projects do map over to the UN SDGs. And you can see this clear pattern of where it can make an impact, but you can see, like, if you break it down into certain pieces, it's used for economic empowerment. As an example, for in agriculture, if somebody wants to know that the plant damage is about to happen by using low altitude sensors, it's going to help someone at the very end. So for economic empowerment, for education, for educational challenges, as an example, for the adaptive learning technologies that can help students based on their past performance. For obviously natural disasters, crisis response, for environmental challenges, obviously for health, for things which might actually be making money, like early diagnosis of diseases like cancer, diabetes, and also for equality and inclusion, which obviously covers people with disabilities. So there's a whole area, a wide variety of places where it's already being used for social good. And a clear way to map is with some of the organizations who are leading the chart, who have directories of some of these crazy good projects.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, kind of taking a step backwards now, I know we covered just now like what we all think that AI for good actually means, but how can we actually be using AI for bad per se, or negatively? What do you think, Anirudh, if you want to take that one?
I think the recent strikes that in the Bay Area, where projects which we're working on the military side of things, to train things which might lead to elimination of some humans, would probably be looked at the more bad sides of using AI. That's probably the most common example I can find.
And Michael, what about your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that, frankly, I think that it can be used in there's the one type of cases where you could say, like, a bad actor, for instance, gets a hold of artificial intelligence and is able to use it for instance, like autonomous weaponry. So that would be like Project Maven, for example, in Google. I'm not necessarily saying that's good or bad, but rather that's an example that workers at Google have said is bad, and thus Google stopped working on it. I would say, though, more perniciously is the fact that, like, people, it might not even be used by bad actors, but rather naive actors. And by that, I mean, for instance, that the artificial intelligence or whatever subsystem is being trained on data that in and of itself is flawed and reflects past biases. So the primary example that comes to mind for me is predictive policing. Predictive policing is, it aims to identify where crime happens, or those who will be impacted by a crime in advance of it happening. And the data that is being used on, that those models are being trained on, is being pulled from data sources that are inherently biased based on policing practices up to this day. So you can see that, in fact, the AI Now Institute out of NYU was just released a report last week about this topic specifically, and that, for instance, police departments that have been under consent decree, which is in the United States, it's a process that the Department of Justice, which is a federal department, actually comes in and does an audit on the department and says that they have to live up to X, Y, Z in order to be improved. And these consent decrees are often based on discriminatory practices that the police engage in. And while these folks are under a consent decree and all the data that they've collected, they may, quote unquote, clean up their act as per the consent decree. However, the data that they collected during the time when they were engaging in the practices that got them there to begin with is in fact being used to train the models that are now helping them police more. So this is like obviously not a great situation, because the situation that got them to become under consent decree in the first place is now being institutionalized, if you will, into the technology that's now informing the policing going forward. So I think that those are more of the like AI for bad, if you will. I am not afraid of autonomous robots. I'm afraid of artificial intelligence that will exacerbate the existing cleavages in our society.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I guess flipping it on its head again. So we spoke about where AI is currently being used for social good. So where do you think that we'll see the most impactful progressions in the next 5 or 10 years, maybe in industries or areas where it's not currently being utilized? Anirudh, do you want to go for that one first of all?
So maybe I'll take a step down to from the application to what will empower it. So the technology side, people are putting their AI models up publicly on the web so that others can take that, transfer it on their own problem, and very quickly use it for their own use cases. So what it's really getting towards is, because it's getting easier and easier for people to train some of these AI models. In fact, these days you can do it even without coding itself. So that's one reason why we can start to see a lot more people getting into it and building things. The number two is that to get it to production, specifically, to sensors, to IoT, AI is starting to run not on just the cloud, but on edge devices. So you might have heard of examples of, uh, getting early detection of skin cancer by using a camera app that people are now using. Examples of diabetic retinopathy by using a camera scanner. That's because the AI can run on the device. But now we are even going towards, if you think about wildlife, where you have to put thousands of sensors to know, you now have solar-powered AI chips which run battery-free, which technically means it can run for a long time. So when you have a great place to run the AI, a great way for people to actually build the AI, I think that's where we'll start to see a lot more. And the fact that we have debate on this is going to lead to a lot of progress. So I would see a lot of impact happening, especially in the wildlife poaching sector side, where there's already starting to make a lot of difference. There's this whole area of disinformation. Using WhatsApp to spread and manipulate information. I mean, it has manipulated some of the election results, but it has even led to mob killings in Mexico and in India because of the dissemination of false information. If we have AI systems that can actually prevent this misinformation from going out, that's, I think, a core area where in the next 5 years, I would say a lot of improvement happening. Obviously, in economic empowerment, as I previously mentioned, in crisis response specifically. I'll give you a nice example here. NASA has federal development labs where every summer they try to work on the next generation projects that can help. So, usually these projects are, where is an asteroid belt? Where to land on the moon? And this year, the most sought after projects was how to help firefighters using satellite images, and how we can bring all these space scientists and AI scientists together to solve this. So you can see where some of these impact will come in the coming years.
Yeah, brilliant. That's so interesting. And so with these advances, obviously making sure the general public is kept in the loop is really important. We need to be transparent with these models. So Michael, whose responsibility do you think this is? Should it be the government? Should it be the companies who are creating the AI itself, or something else entirely?
I think it needs to be the government. I mean, we have, it's evident that the companies cannot police themselves, and that they are, that frankly, that's like not their job, right? I think that it is a betrayal of the concept of public goods, and frankly of public welfare that the government, let's use the United States for an example, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, but that we should be giving up the process and institutions that we as a United States public have developed over 200 plus years to global multinational companies whose job it is to deliver value to their shareholders and not necessarily to deliver like safe, secure technology to the public. And that is their mission in so much as that it enables them to continue to sell their products and be profitable. But we should not be pushing those responsibilities onto those companies, and instead should figure out a way as a democratic public to work better with those companies, to set regulations, to set parameters that are assuring that, say, their innovation is allowed to flourish and to continue to allow them to be successful in developing the technologies that do scale out to the public, while at the same time assuring that the public is protected. So I think that there's like a big place for not only existing government institutions, but I think frankly we need to be moving into a conversation about broad institutional reform in the United States to actually be agile enough to deal with the types of technologies that are akin to the electrification of the United States or the world, but we don't yet have the regulatory or institutional bodies to manage that.
Absolutely, I think you're so right, and we need to make sure that all of these regulations are in place so that AI is able to thrive and continue growing and helping us reach this better society. So thus far, what do you think, maybe Anirudh, if you'd like to take this one, what do you think are some of the most notable achievements or progressions of AI for social good so far?
Things that I've already seen, that have already happened. When you take Flint, Michigan, you have over 55,000 parcels of land on which you have to change pipes. Which are these homes that you have to change the pipes on? So someone developed an AI model to go and make a prediction on which houses need those changes first, which are more important. So that's like one great example. In wildlife poaching, which is like a multi-billion-dollar illegal industry, by training drones, which are flying to take infrared images, models have been developed to basically assess where poachers are coming from and for law authorities to go and catch them. That's like a great example. For people with disabilities, I think I mentioned about the example of Aira already. The another example was Singhia, which I had previously worked on, where the best example I've heard so far was someone who was lost in a hurricane in Puerto Rico was able to come to safety because he had a cell phone app which could tell him that where danger is and where it's not. So I think maybe I'll mention a few examples on people with disabilities. So obviously you could say speech recognition has obvious uses for people with hearing loss. So one of the really great examples is a tool called, Google has a tool, Google Translate, and Microsoft has something called Microsoft Translator. At Rochester Institute of Technology, they have about 1,500 students who have profound hearing loss. And so when teachers speak and give lectures, they usually have a cart transcriber who's typing the words that are being spoken in the lecture. And you can imagine if you put a speech recognition technology, well, it won't fly as easily, because when you hear the word like mitochondrion or adenosine triphosphate, that's a very technical word for a speech recognition system to catch. But by picking up the words from your presentation files, the language model can be improved. And what happened in that particular school was by putting this technology of Microsoft Translator in the slides, the card transcribers started to ask, how can we help even beyond? Because the speech recognition was catching the words really well. So I might actually cue this to an example I want to show, which was probably the most mind-blowing thing that I have ever seen on my computer. If you can switch the display.
Absolutely. That should have switched for you now. Does that work?
Yeah. Can you see my screen with the mouse?
Yes, I'm able to.
Yes.
Alrighty, perfect. So this is an example of, this is a Professor Brian Cragen from the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's a professor in computer science, and he teaches either with English or with sign language. And I should have mentioned that he was deaf. He is deaf. And so as you might imagine, if someone has not had the feedback while growing up on voice, as you and I might have had, their accent would become a bit hard to understand. So as a result, when students enroll in his class, they often drop out because they find it hard to understand him. So let me actually play his voice first.
We just talked about so many examples from the last class. Yeah, I have a few more examples to show you.
So I think if you close your eyes and try to hear it, it might have been a bit hard to understand. So if you run this through like a general speech recognition system, it said, we just talked about money again for the large car. I have a few more, whatever it is, right? But could we do better than that? So beyond speech recognition, you could use language models of what's being spoken, and even that doesn't help. So then by training a model based on his transcript, so taking 2 hours of his voice and the words he spoke, this is the result that started to come. Let me actually just play the voice again so you can see how hard it is.
We just talked about so many examples from the last class. Yeah, I have a few more examples to show you.
So, when people went from basic speech recognition to using audio models and language models together, they're able to do actually better than most of the human transcribers. And I think that shows where the power and magic of AI can come, when you have enough data and a great use case, a user who really, really wants it. So you already have started to see self-driving wheelchairs by Panasonic, in airports already out. Some of the other examples I do want to mention is, even in infrastructure management, for example, cameras that are being kept so that people don't have to wait long time on red lights, as an example. People with autism, especially when students with autism using, there's a group called in Stanford called the Autism Glass Project, along with Effectiva. They are trying to use automatic emotion recognition to provide social cues to people who are on the autism spectrum. So these are some examples that come to mind off the head.
Yeah, thank you for those examples. That's really, really interesting. So, Michael, kind of going back towards you now, what areas do you think need the most focus in making sure that AI kind of benefits the next generation? Do you think it's encouraging more diversity at AI, or working on more initiatives for younger people to get into artificial intelligence and that kind of thing?
I mean, I'm gonna lean back on what I was saying before to a degree, and add it with the yes, I think that more diversity in the field is absolutely essential. I mean, I think that we can agree that no matter one's personal perspective or prerogatives, your own implicit biases are going to show up in the type of code that you develop. And that we can ameliorate that issue to a certain degree by just assuring that the people that are making the technology are representative of not only, say, the American public, but rather the global public, right? So, for instance, I think often to the example that facial recognition software is often unable to recognize dark-skinned faces, and that is, primarily due to the fact that the people that are making it have not per se adequately trained it on dark skin faces. And that's a major limitation to the technology when you consider that we want to potentially use this globally, and most of the globe does not look like the primary group of people who make that technology in Silicon Valley. So that's certainly like a big, very, very big piece of it. And I think, secondly, like I said before, I think we really need to consider what is the role of global institutions? What is the role of democratic institutions? So not necessarily relying on, as much as I love them, the United Nations to come up with these rules, because the United Nations has no teeth in enforceability. And similarly, like, I think that there's a big push right now in Silicon Valley and beyond for companies to develop their own ethical codes and whatnot, but I think that those are nice. I don't think that those are going to be the thing that moves the needle, because as soon as shareholder value pushes one way or another, I think the first thing that will go out the window is the ethical codes. And so, in so much as that we can have popular, by popular I mean democratic participation in the development of norms and the institutionalization of those norms into laws through ideally new regulatory bodies, I think that that's really going to be the thing that really moves us forward in such a way that makes sure that the AI that is good gets better, and AI that perhaps is not good can can look to examples and can look to laws and regulations that are on the books to be more aligned with what we, the public, think that the world should actually look like vis-a-vis technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there actually many kind of regulations in place at the moment?
So in the United States, I mean, obviously we have GDPR, which not in the United States, but globally GDPR is a major win for privacy. There's obviously some things that could be worked on with it, and I think refinements can be made, but I think that that's like, we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. However, I do think that you have, for instance, in fact, just this past week, Japan announced that they were considering starting a new regulatory body around these types of technology, as well as like antitrust and big tech. So there's like some movement there. In the United States, the example that comes to mind most is the city of New York this past year developed an automated decision-making task force. And excuse me, what that task force has been tasked with was to come up with a set of rules that will help evaluate the technologies that are being introduced and assure that they are aligned with, if the technology is going to be making decisions, assure that they are aligned with what the popular will in the city of New York is. So I see that as, and now the state of Washington in the United States is taking up a similar task. It's currently a Senate bill, so it hasn't yet passed by any means, and certainly has a longer way to go, but it is moving towards that. So I think you have some examples. They're fairly nascent and they're fairly small scale, but I think that ultimately, like in the parlance of web development and engineering, this is the MVP, right? This is our minimum viable product, or in this case, minimum viable policy. And I think that this is like the right way to test and the right way to start. And then based on the results here, we can start to move forward in a way that's aligned with industry, as well as meaningfully reforming the way that these technologies operate.
Yeah, definitely. So Anirudh, kind of following on from this, where do you think the current gaps are, and who do you think should close them? Should it be companies building specific AI for good projects, or do you think something else should be in place?
So there are two ways. One is obviously from the government side that we just discussed.
Yeah, of course.
From NGO side, that the second part comes in, and then from for-profit companies. One of the key things that I do see is that if you really want a project to go big, and it requires resources, to turn it into some sort of a business at the end. so that it's like self-sustaining. So as an example, if people are working on solving cancer, there is a business value to it at the end of the day. Uh, uh, Similarly, when people are talking about wildfires, there's a business value to help firefighters, and also by showing the different stakeholders who can actually benefit from it, the funds would come in to keep improving it and taking it further and further ahead. So having a self-sustaining cycle where initially you can get a push from the government, to get the initial funds as one example. Obviously, for businesses to see that area, to make investments in it. So one thing I do want to make sure is people should not think of AI for good as always a charity case, uh, especially if it can help businesses on both sides as well as people at the exact same time. I should actually, just to go to the last answer that Michael gave, I'll actually maybe give a little bit of a more fun side of things you would not expect on who is encouraging AI for social good. Well, the Pope is. If you so the Pope and the Vatican actually just opened a prize for young researchers that you have a great idea, go do a project on AI for good, and maybe it might win the best dissertation award from the Vatican, and then you can go and high five the Pope. How cool is that, right? Another example I can give uh, is how many companies are now who have large pockets are showing their social and corporate responsibility, not just for their own employees, but for generically outside. So as an example, Google has a $25 million purse, a pool for AI for good projects. So you can basically go apply, and if you get selected, you would get some amount for the project that you want. Microsoft has about $125 million purse for similar projects. So it's about 50 million for projects related to AI for Earth, 25 million for AI for accessibility, 40 million for AI for humanitarian action. Similarly, National Science Foundation, it keeps giving you know grants. But recently there was a partnership in AI along with NSF, which was about, I believe, $5 million. Another great example is you work on the project and you enter the X prize, and you might just win that $5 million purse. So, if you don't want to just do it for the good, like do it for the money and get in.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of moving on to some of the challenges, Michael, back to you for this one. How can we assure that AI applications are good when there's a lack of democratic consensus and accountability within the organizations that do control most of the resources to pursue AI at scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this really gets back to, this is obviously a foundational problem with anything that we do, is there's not necessarily there's not necessarily the processes in place to determine what good means. And so I think that this is really where it comes down to bringing, kind of surfacing this technology, pulling it out of, say, the quote unquote shadows, if you will, and bringing it into popular conversation and bringing it up with finding venues where people who just, regularly participate in daily life, right? And they maybe watch news occasionally, and they vote in their local elections, and really thinking about, like, what does the process look like on a local level to determine how these things look. So I think that this is really where the City of New York task force, I thought, was a really great example, is that they dedicated a specific body to determine how this should work. And I think that ultimately, like, it would be great to have those types of things in every major city. And I'm really much more interested in kind of like this, what's known as like a grass tops solution. So it's a grassroots meets top down. So we can have the United Nations, and we can have industry groups. We can have the partnership on AI determining, what are the accountability metrics? What does good mean? on one hand, and then on the other hand, we should also have localities and municipalities and state and federal governments around the world doing the same exercise. And from there, I think that we can start to, we being society, really start to met out what this means, right? I think that there's like an analysis piece that once all of these processes have taken place, that we can really start to think like, okay, this is what good means based on X amount of data, and then really start to move these rules. I mean, I think that this technology is moving so quickly, and we shouldn't be pausing it, but we should also though be actively moving in the direction of having state and local governments taking up this issue as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Anirudh, what do you think are some of the main problems that arise when we are actually trying to tackle these social issues?
I would say maybe the challenge that you face, the bottlenecks that you face when you're trying to go after making an impact. I think obviously data, the AI expertise, some of the regulations that are there, I think they take the big crux. So for example, the access to the right data and access to the volume of data that you need to solve a particular problem. Similarly, the quality of the data, the label of the data, or is it something which is just weakly labeled based on some metric? These actually have like the big crux. Now, obviously you need somebody to train it, somebody to work on these particular problems. So the AI expertise that is available to solve a particular topic, because there's limited amount of talent out there, that would be taking also a pretty important. That's also one of the main limitations that we find. Now, having worked in an area where there can be some gray areas related to medical regulations, whether AI crosses them or not. So there are some regulatory limitations. And for people who want to make an impact, they have to kind of take care of the laws around sometimes privacy, sometimes medical laws and all. So I would say these would probably be some of the challenges around.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And I mean, obviously now we're seeing AI applications being used more and more, and they're coming into our everyday lives for a variety of potential benefits to society. But obviously, as we've mentioned throughout this whole conversation, this can raise lots of challenges. And some of these challenges are around ethics and robust design. So, Michael, what do you think some of like the key challenges here are?
I mean, I think that again, this gets down to like what do we mean by ethics, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is a big piece, but I think also though, like really is like I think the biggest piece really is like getting the folks who are the builders of this technology to understand and learn ethics, in the sense that if you're a computer scientist, for instance, you may not have had more than a single class on ethics. And similarly, if you're an ethicist, you likely never took a computer science class. So, bridging the gap between the languages of computer science and ethics, I think is really the biggest challenge. I think that what ends up happening is not that there are very few bad actors, right? This is not the. I think there are very few people who are like actively seeking to make AI that is unethical. I think, however, that people make AI that is maybe like not ethical, but not necessarily unethical by nature of the fact that they maybe don't understand like what that even means. I frankly maybe don't understand what that means, right? I think that there's many of us who could frankly revisit our University 101 class on ethics in order to inform what we're doing. And I think that that's really a big piece, is really just kind of assuring that the people who know what ethics means are able to speak to those who actually know how to build the thing that's going to, scale ethics globally.
Definitely. And I mean, continuing on the ethics topic, Anirudh, how do you think that we can make sure that AI doesn't inherit some of the intrinsic faults that humans just have? How do we make sure that the systems don't become biased in those senses?
Yeah, humans have too many faults. Uh, so, um, so one of the, it actually also combines ethics, transparency, and many other areas. Uh, some of the leaders in the world of AI have to be speaking out constantly. So it's a mainstream conversation that goes beyond the people who even understand AI. So as an example, we were talking a few minutes ago about transparency and that companies maybe might not disclose. So there's this great area of where people keep exposing the bias in language models, uh, exposing bias in computer vision models and face recognition. This paper uh, by Joy Buolo Maveni, which is called Gender Shades, which was basically showing how, because the data sets have been trained on people in the Western world, when you take people in Africa, it just messes up. Females, it messes up. And based on that one single paper, how many of the companies actually ended up to prevent bad publicity, changing their models, collecting the data in those underserved areas, and suddenly the models started to actually get better, better, better. So having that on the ground activism to shame companies, is a great motivation to do well. So you can take that. Also, we talked about transparency of some other models. So you know how we have LinkedIn for people. Imagine we had LinkedIn but for AI models, where you just don't see all the the goods of what the thing is doing, like where you just don't see how the model can perform, but what does it perform on a particular data set? How is it reproducible? And more importantly, what is the inherent bias in that particular model, maybe based on the item it was trained on? So there's a great paper called Model Cards by Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, which is basically trying to show, I'm hoping in the next 2 years, it would be very common for when you see an AI-related project to also see side by side the bias it has, so people can make a very good understanding of where not to use this particular item. So it's kind of like being more and more transparent. But the researchers, if they keep their voice shouting up, that would make companies for which they work at make it a general practice. And the more it's common, the better it gets.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, brilliant. Sorry.
I'd like to say a couple of things actually on that too,
Absolutely.
because I think what Anirudh brought up with Joy Bolowini's piece on paper gender shades, I think that, and that's a great example that it's, and I sort of had alluded to this earlier, that is the type of thing where companies now, like, because of the bias that was inherent in their algorithms, being unable to recognize people in the non-Western world, which is most of the world, that was really bad for business, right? It's not that it was just like not good for, like, from an ethical perspective, and it was pushing discriminatory practice, but it was also just like really bad for business if you're unable to reach 2/3 of the world's population. So I think we need to start using these stories as something that companies should be rewarded for, right? The companies who make those changes should be rewarded in the market for the fact that now that they can reach 2/3 more people. The shareholders of those companies need to be understand. We need to, as companies, as CEOs or as CFOs, when they're talking to their shareholders, they should be able to use these examples and say, listen, like, not only was this the right thing to do, it was actually very profitable for us. So aligning those incentives, I think, and using, like, leveraging storytelling and equipping people with storytelling capabilities, I think that that's a really big opportunity to move the needle on these sorts of things.
Absolutely. And just one more quick question before we move on. Do either of you think that there are any industries that shouldn't be using AI? And if so, why?
I can
go ahead, Aira.
Okay, so I was actually going to say the opposite of, we talk about defense. But if you, I'll actually maybe say the opposite. DARPA and Pentagon are actually sponsoring AI projects, many of which will actually improve AI, which might, for just making people more productive and effective. So there's like a bunch of grants that are available, which might not be the traditional defense that you might imagine, but which would be more trying to reason of how someone would want to behave and have wide scale uses. So I'll give the floor to my friend here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say honestly, one of the big ones is, and I had mentioned it earlier, I don't think it should be used in policing. I think that it is it is the level of bias in the existing data set is so deep. And I don't think that we have an adequate process currently. And this isn't to say that maybe in some point in the future, but I think that right now the level of bias in the data is so deep, we don't yet have an adequate way to clean or correct that bias. And given that, I think that it just truly exacerbates the issues that we already see. And I think that it not only results in over policing of certain communities, and not only results in like a higher therefore incarceration rate of those communities, like the network or the externalities of over policing and higher incarceration rates just lead to such deleterious effects on communities writ large, right? It makes people unable to vote in the future if they're been incarcerated for a felony. It makes them unable to get more housing lending, which then results in lower educational funding for neighborhoods. I mean, just the amount of effects that over policing has on communities is just myriad. And I think that given the risks with the data that we currently are using to train the models, I just don't think it should be allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just ask a couple more quick questions on just the benefits of AI before we swoop into some questions. I've got quite a few questions coming in from the attendees. So just quickly, Michael, where do you think the average individual will find a positive impact from AI?
I think we're already seeing them. Right? I think that we just don't know it. Right? I think that this is I don't think it's going to be Rosie the robot folding my laundry, and that's in the very near future. But I think it's going to be more along the lines of I know this is very boring, but the ability to communicate with the services that you already use, right? So chatbots are a really pedestrian example, yet sometimes you just want to get an answer to your question very quickly, and that helps. I think that those are the things that are today are already happening. I think tomorrow is going to be in healthcare. I think that you're going to be able to use the data that you are already producing through biometric sensors and frankly through your iPhone or your smartphone, and then be able to ideally get what I see as precision medicine, right? It's not necessarily that I'm going to be able to cure the cancer, but rather to I early identify the cancer based on a complex data set and machine learning model that then tells me that you're at higher risk. And then once you're there, it's here are the 3 things that we should use based on the existing data. So I think precision medicine is probably something that we're going to see soon, and more of it soon rather. And I think that will scale out to the general public, in the next few years, let's say 5 to 10.
Brilliant. Carry on.
The quickest example is, which is already happening right now. So many people actually went to doctors saying my Apple Watch thinks something is wrong with me. And turns out that their ECG was actually giving some pretty bad indications when they actually went to the medical place. People who have had a fall, their Apple Watch started to basically monitor their ECG and heart rate and figure out something is going to go bad. So that's an example where it's already making a lot of difference.
Absolutely. So Anirudh, what do you think the next steps are? What are the current bottlenecks stopping us from kind of really progressing in this area?
So I think more organizations are coming together to get their data sets together. For example, when some of the hurricanes happened, many of the satellite companies which sell their data for profit actually came and gave their data so that which areas had been flooded could be analyzed quicker. Secondly, the bottleneck on talent. That's as governments start to push AI agenda so that more and more people know about it at least different levels. Either they are deep into coding or maybe they just want to get in towards it and the tools become easier. That would reduce the shortage in talent. In China, they are actually giving 5-day boot camps on AI to elementary students. So just wait for 10 years and see what happens.
Definitely. And Michael, did you have anything to add there before we move on to some questions?
No, I think that's the questions are good.
Okay, brilliant. So the first question that we've had come in, Michael, if you'd like to take this one, someone's asked, how can companies work around with different regulations in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ultimately going to be like the biggest challenge, right? It's you end up with a patchwork of regulation that may have been agreed upon, if you will, by local industry players, but are not necessarily scaled globally. I mean, I think that this is going to be, hey, if you're a lawyer, get in now, because that's probably the best way to do it. And I think ultimately, you probably, from a company's perspective, you would need to design for the most stringent one, and then just work your way. Like if you design for the most stringent regulations, then you end up being able to abide by the ones that are the least stringent.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone's also asked, this is to both of you, how many ethicists, if any, are employed at both of your companies?
None currently at ours. I think that this is kind of it's actually a big hot job, if you will, in Silicon Valley now, is becoming an AI ethicist. And that's great. But right now we don't currently have any. But frankly, we only we're just a venture capital firm, so
sure.
Yeah, not
and
necessarily.
What about you, Anirudh?
Yeah, same here, but I would say that ethics is like an ingrained like a part of the culture. I remember at my previous employer, every employee actually had to pass a course on privacy and on ethics. So having that kind of culture where people are shown bad examples and how to do it well is something that we hope everybody does.
Yeah, I would actually add that that's probably the preferred method, right? Like if you're a big company, for instance, like I have a friend, she's the chief ethical architect at Salesforce, and if you're a big company, that's great. You should have that because you need a single point and a clearinghouse, if you will, for these types of questions. Whereas if you're at smaller companies, everyone should have a piece of it, right? It shouldn't be incumbent upon one person to, walk into a meeting where everyone is acting unethically, and then the one person who's the ethical person comes in and says, you should all act ethically now. It's more of like, no, everyone should sort of be acting ethically to begin with. And like ingraining it, as Anirudh said, is like, I think, a much more effective strategy.
Definitely. I think we've got time for one more question. So, Anirudh, do you think that AI will be able to address the ingrained biases in society, or will it actually accentuate them?
Great question. So at the end of the day, if we realize how biases come in, we would actively try to explain them, to discover them, to be transparent about them, but more importantly, work towards reducing them in our data sets itself. So it comes by having the stakeholders that we're building the technology for being an active part of the development process, having the more realistic real world data sets. So even when we go out collecting data, we might be making mistakes in how this is collected. There's obviously historical biases on particular projects, on particular areas. So if we actually do, let's just call it a bias audit of the problem area you are going to work on, and anticipate which all areas it can come from, having a measure of that in certain ways, and developing like a framework to actively reduce them will only happen if we are from the get-go keeping that as one of the key pieces of your AI project.
Absolutely. And Michael, did you have anything to add as a final note at all?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that question, I think that what Anirudh said is right, and I think that there's actually I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. And I think it's actually that AI will surface the biases that we already have. And this is sort of what Anirudh said, right? It's a around transparency. So right now, for instance, let's say we're talking about AI that can help make judicial decisions around bail, right? This is something that we're seeing happening more and more as, we're using algorithms to determine and set bail for people who are incarcerated or have been arrested. Right now, those biases, they already exist. They're already in the judge's mind, right? And not to say that that judge is malicious, but those biases are in that judge's mind. We currently have no capacity to analyze and to surface those biases in a transparent way. Whereas if we use algorithms that are based on the data that judge has been, basing his decisions on and making over the past X amount of years, we're actually able to transparently see where those biases lie and have an opportunity to correct them. So I think it has the opportunity to accentuate bias because just the speed and scale of the technology, while at the same time sort of clarifying and giving us a framework for where bias exists and a roadmap for that, and then can use that to ideally kind of quash it or correct against it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that might be all we've got time for now, but thank you both so much. It's been a great discussion, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed chatting with me today.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks,
Thank you.
Aira.
Take care,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye.